Hello, so my name is Noonan. I'm from the Cooper Union, and I'm really excited to talk to you about my project, which aimed to turn trash into treasure, or more specifically, organic waste feedstocks into a carbon dioxide adsorbent called biochar for carbon dioxide removal to help mitigate climate change. So the motivation for this project started with my literature review, where I reviewed adsorbents in industry and came up with the question, can biochar, a material with high CO2 absorption capacity, made from organic waste, be an industry competitive and more environmentally friendly and cost-effective carbon dioxide adsorbent for carbon dioxide removal compared to adsorbents currently used in the carbon capture industry? So for how biochar works in research, if we were to replace an adsorbent that is currently used for flue gas removal, as adsorption for just greenhouse gas removal often focuses on point source removal, so from a flue gas stack. The adsorbent is on the flue gas stack and actually captures the carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases from the emissions rather than directly from the air, which would be direct air capture. So the principle of this would be that carbon dioxide is in the air after emissions at ambient temperature, pressure, and concentration. It's sucked into a carbon dioxide adsorption capture plant and then adsorbed onto the adsorbent, which we are hoping to replace with biochar, and you'll be convinced why by the end of our presentation. So biochar, to elaborate, is carbonized organic waste with strong carbon dioxide adsorption capability due to its properties of high surface area, stable aromatic carbon content, and a net negative production process called pyrolysis. So for pyrolysis, we start with an organic waste feedstock. Pictured here, you see sawdust. The feedstock is put into the furnace under pure nitrogen. It's heated to the desired temperature, left in the furnace for 7 minutes until the reaction is complete. The products are threefold gaseous liquid and biochar. This work focused on biochar. And it's very important that we don't further modify the biochar by heat activation, metal activation, or any other type of activation which would make it activated carbon. And the reason for this is to reduce labor and costs associated with making activated carbon. So we're quite literally just charcoaling trash and turning it into a carbon dioxide adsorbent. We put it in the thermogravimetric analyzer for carbon dioxide adsorption testing. So to orient you about what we're trying to achieve, direct air capture or DAC plants aiming to commercialize their carbon dioxide adsorbents, which are often made from amines, which are harmful to the environment during production and during usage and at the end of their lifetimes, as they're a pollutant for water and the environment in general. These adsorbents are achieving 66 milligrams per gram, so that's the standard. The greatest biochar capacity that I found in my literature review was 73.55 milligrams per gram, which means that it's really worth investigating biochar to see how we can actually achieve this value consistently rather than just one paper achieving it. So for the average, it is around 70 that we found in literature at a variety of pyrolysis temperatures at ambient CO2 adsorption temperature, or 25 degrees Celsius, which further speaks to biochar's promise in literature. But again, these production conditions are pretty variable, so we wanted to figure out how to get this value consistently for potential in scale-up and using this product in industry. So that leads me to our question, what factors influence carbon dioxide absorption capacity on biochar? Now, one caveat to what was found in the literature is 20 milligrams of sample is 10 times more than what we used, which I'll elaborate on in 1 minute. And this was pyrolyzed at 900 degrees Celsius, which is a high temperature, and a 1-hour adsorption test. So if you're trying to adsorb carbon dioxide in a direct air capture plant, and it's taking 1 hour to adsorb that much carbon dioxide, the 73, that's a long time. So we're trying to do it faster. So for our experimental design, we focused on 3 independent variables, which were the feedstock type, pyrolysis or production temperature, and adsorption, desorption test conditions. And we wanted to identify the optimal of each one of these 3 for maximum carbon dioxide adsorption and desorption capacities and rate. So as a breakdown of our pyrolysis process, we examined 8 feedstocks. In literature, most people and studies examine 1 to 3 feedstocks. We tested over a range of pyrolysis temperatures from 500 to 800 degrees Celsius. We chose to pyrolyze the walnut and the sawdust feedstocks at the higher range of temperatures for comparability to literature, as these ones were studied more often. So we pyrolyzed at those temperatures, ended up with biochar and tested for adsorption at 25 to 75 degrees Celsius. For a breakdown of how the visual that you saw before works when we apply biochar, This is a light microscope picture that we took in our lab of our biochar samples, and the biochar works by physically absorbing carbon dioxide into the pores. So for how we conducted our tests, this is a sample adsorption test program from the thermogravimetric analyzer, the instrument that you saw on the previous slide. We start with an isothermal hold in nitrogen, and we heat to 75 degrees Celsius to dry the biochar and remove moisture. We then cool the biochar to the desired adsorption test temperature. We turn on the carbon dioxide, 33% in nitrogen, on for 5 minutes, and we turn it off for 5 minutes for the adsorption and then the desorption testing. So adsorption when it's on, and desorption is when the carbon dioxide is off. And the flow rate is 50 milliliters per minute for the carbon dioxide, 100 milliliters per minute for the nitrogen. So to talk about our results, we found that feedstock matters a lot when we pyrolyze the biochar at low temperatures, and we tested it at 50 degrees Celsius. So you can see the breakdown from the corn cob, the least increasing to the greatest adsorption capacity on the sawdust. The greatest, there's kind of a big variation there, so that's not really desirable for achieving consistent results, but we did identify that feedstock does matter. Then we investigated the effects of feedstock on the adsorption rate when the feedstocks were pyrolyzed at a low temperature of 500 degrees. So we found a pretty consistent least to greatest order with the feedstocks for the adsorption capacity and rate, further confirming that the feedstocks do matter. We found up to a 2 times difference in carbon dioxide adsorption capacity between the least and the greatest. The values that achieve the least and the greatest on the different feedstocks, so corn cob compared to sawdust, and up to a 4 times difference between these in the rate. So then for our second independent variable, we examined the effects of pyrolysis temperature on adsorption capacity, and we found that increasing the pyrolysis temperature yielded a greater carbon dioxide adsorption capacity, but not only that, the difference in adsorption capacity between the sawdust and the walnut biochar feedstocks actually became really small as the pyrolysis temperature increased, which is really optimal for applying this product into industry, because if we don't have to separate different types of organic waste, we can just simply put all of organic waste into a furnace and expect a higher and same CO2 adsorption capacity. If we use 800 degrees Celsius to produce it, that's really important because it reduces costs with labor and waste separation. And also we found, because of this, carbon dioxide adsorption capacity is independent of feedstock type when it's pyrolyzed at high temperatures. So for the pyrolysis temperature effect on the adsorption rate, on the left you can see our raw data, which is just the capacity over time. And when we analyzed the rate differential data, we found a steady increase in rate with increasing pyrolysis temperature, which is also optimal for carbon dioxide adsorption. So it looks like the higher pyrolysis temperature is optimal for both increasing rates and capacities. Next, we tested the effects of adsorption temperature. We found that lower adsorption temperature yields a higher CO2 adsorption capacity on the biochar, which is expected due to the endothermic nature of the adsorption reaction. So then now we can kind of begin to identify our optimal conditions for both adsorption temperature and pyrolysis temperature. Since we saw an increase in rate and capacity with increased pyrolysis temperature independent of feedstock, we can identify that 800 is the optimal pyrolysis temperature, and because 25 degrees Celsius adsorption temperature or decreasing from 75 degrees adsorption temperature increases the capacity for feedstocks pyrolyzed at low and high temperatures. Therefore, the 25 degrees is optimal, which is close to ambient temperatures. So this is great for direct air capture and just taking carbon dioxide out of ambient air. And to kind of go back to the literature review table that you saw in the beginning, comparing our highest adsorption capacity for producing and testing at optimal conditions, so producing at 800C and testing at 25, we're achieving pretty similar values to literature with a 5-minute as opposed to 1-hour adsorption test and 1 to 2 milligrams of sample as opposed to literature using 20, which is a pretty important finding when trying to absorb the most carbon dioxide to help mitigate climate change. So for our effects of adsorption temperature on the peak adsorption rates, for increasing adsorption temperature, we found an increase in rate, which is also expected due to the endothermic nature of the adsorption on the biochar, and so we just confirmed that that was happening on our samples, and we also found that for the feedstocks pyrolyzed at low and high temperature, this is true. So to summarize our findings, the optimal conditions for CO2 absorption and desorption capacity that we identified in this work were that 25 degrees absorption temperature helped the biochar achieve maximum CO2 absorption capacity on all samples, parallelized at low and high temperatures. We found that the 50 degrees Celsius was optimal for maximum absorption rate, and if this was increased to our 75 degree data, we expect the same trend. The caveat to this is that the measured absorption capacity is slightly decreased, and we found that the 800 degrees Celsius pyrolysis temperature for maximum absorption, independent of feedstock type, was our optimal condition, and also that it's independent of feedstock is important for industry when reducing costs with waste separation. So our contributions to the existing literature in this field are that we've tested 8 feedstocks, and in experimental literature, often 1, 2, or 3 feedstocks are tested over a smaller 100 to 200 degree pyrolysis temperature range. So we tested these 8 feedstocks, or we tested 2 feedstocks over the higher range, and then we tested 8 feedstocks in total to further understand the effect of feedstocks on carbon dioxide absorption on biochar. Then we also identified the temperatures for achieving maximum carbon dioxide absorption, desorption rates, and capacities. It's also important to note that we did conduct regeneration tests and found desorption capacity averages at identical absorption test temperatures. So if the test was performed for absorption at 25 degrees, we performed desorption at also 25 degrees, and the capacity over these 5-minute adsorption, desorption, so 10-minute cycle test was 91 to 95%, which is optimal for use in carbon capture plants. So what does this mean when we compare to industry once again, and then for broader implications? So our highest value was 61 milligrams per gram, and since industry is achieving 66 milligrams per gram, this is a good comparison. We also identified how to consistently achieve higher values that are comparable to the greatest values in literature that are achieved on one sample with longer testing. And then the arguably most important part of our study was that we found that 21.6 kilograms of our highest performing sample adsorbing at its maximum rate is enough to fulfill carbon dioxide absorption goals that are set by companies aiming to commercialize direct air capture technology. So biochar is an extremely strong competitor to this industry, and we're hoping to further continue this research to commercialize. And yeah, I'd just like to acknowledge our research group and the chemical engineering department references, and I'd be happy to take any questions at this time.
We have this sequence.
Thank you. Question. So you're raising the temperature for pyrolysis up to 800. What do you think is coming out of that feedstock?
So you're saying about emissions in the furnace? Yeah, so the products of pyrolysis are threefold. There's the biochar, there's a liquid product, so it's a bio-oil, which is studied for sustainable fuel, and a synthetic gas. So pyrolysis is essentially burning not in the presence of oxygen. Now, the products are 13% syngas, so the others are the bio-oil and the biochar. So 13% is really low emissions, and it's also worth noting, and these are methane, carbon dioxide, and other hydrocarbons. But it's important to note that we're pyrolyzing organic waste, so it would otherwise decompose and then be 100% emissions in the environment, as opposed to 13% syngas. Also, someone in our lab actually created a reactor where the synthetic gas can be circulated back for heating. So that's why I was talking about it being a circular process.
And so 800 was the highest temperature you went to, right?
Yeah, because greater than, I think, 900 or 1,000 can form graphene, which kind of starts to decrease the...
Have you tried that?
We have not, but I read about it in literature, and other people have definitely studied it.
Okay.
Thank you for the talk. You indicated that different feedstocks have different adsorption capacities and adsorption rates. As a scientist, if you would like to understand why this is happening, what properties of the material would you measure, and what do you hypothesize, what is controlling these two?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We looked into the lignin content of the biochar, and we found not a great correlation between the lignin content and the adsorption capacity, but we think that it's due to the biochar's like the lignin in the feedstocks decomposing less at lower temperatures and decomposing more at higher temperatures, so the heavier atoms like oxygen are released, and the biochar becomes more uniform in the hydrogen to carbon and hydrogen oxygen ratio at higher temperatures because the heavier atoms are released.
I think you understand like what is different between this feedstock, but I'm like, as a product, you have this powder in your hand or the granules. What properties of these granules?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so high surface area at increasing pyrolysis temperature due to the physical adsorption is what we hypothesize is causing this. We started to fit kinetic models to the data to confirm this. We started with pseudo first order kinetic, but we think the Avrami model might fit better, so we're still working on that, but high surface area and high carbon content is what's causing this.
So you would measure surface area, and is there a parameter in all your research governed by that maybe?
So you're saying what governs the surface area?
Like these, if you pick one of these guys, what is at the angstrom level that you're interested in?
Angstrom level, I'm trying to recall from the research. I'm not positive.
Where are these, where is carbon dioxide adsorbing in these particles?
Into the pores. Oh, so you're talking,
Okay, you mentioned it, thank you.
okay.
All right, quick question. Yeah, thanks. So I'm wondering, how specific is this for CO2, or is biochar like susceptible to poisoning or something? I'm just thinking if you put it in one of these like flue gas
Yeah,
things,
that's a
like,
great
will it be
question.
poisoned?
So I have seen selectivity tests conducted in literature. We have not done this yet, but biochar does have high CO2 selectivity. It can also absorb other flue gases, such as methane, but the carbon dioxide absorption is generally the highest in literature, so we're expecting a high selectivity for that.
All right, thanks.